might make you happy in the moment, but it's not leading a happy life. And again, I think and I think a lot of us are trying to use today's meaning of happiness without, because it is really rigorous and annoying to have to keep up with these two different happiness things. So we just keep complaining it, but that's basically it.
Well, I just want to get a little bit of the spookiness out of objective standards. I mean, what is happiness? Happiness is a word that we people have in our general lexicon that has an agreed-to definition. And I think, basically, you could define happiness however you want, but not really, because society needs to have an agreed-upon term to use for it. I think objective standards in that sense just means what society has agreed to as being, when you look at something or some object and you're trying to decide if that object, if that's X, is happy, it's going to have these things, probably. But it doesn't have to be objective in the way that, like, and objective and absolute in the way that, say, like a mathematical proof or something that isn't human or is totally, outside of the realm of, like, our kind of general operating kind of reality. It doesn't have to have that kind of, like, supernatural objectivity or that supernatural absoluteness. I think happiness it's standards that are outside just what I, as a person, have desire or preference for. And if I started using the word happy to mean, doing heroin every single day, if I defined that as happy, it wouldn't get me anywhere, because if I said happy and used that word, no one would understand what I was saying, because that's not something that society has agreed to as being generally what happiness means.
Right, Isaac?
So, I think basically that if we start with Aristotle's definition of what happiness is, which is sort of what all our lives are aiming for, it says that. So it's basically the life a person seeks. Then it really could be possible that there are very subjective standards. If the bungee jumping person, if that really is what he's truly actually thinking, it's not just like on drugs or something like that, and that's why hallucinating. If that's really what he's seeking, then that really would be what makes him happy, leads to a happy life. But I think the question of whether they are objective standards then puts it to not so much an ethical but a psychological question, which is if we all got information from others and were fully informed and rational, would we in fact have different standards? And I think people are similar enough that there really are people who would think that the ideal life is to go bungee jumping without. I think people are similar enough that for the most part, people would seek given the same circumstances and people who are rational, they would seek the same life, and in that sense it would be objective standards. But it's not a logical problem to have the existence of subjective standards.
Okay.
To your point, I think that there are a few problems with sort of deciding that objective standards can be determined by a mass group of people, because, I don't know, it seems to me like, first of all, that if you call whatever becomes sort of a stigma or generally agreed upon to be happiness, then first of all, it's not objective at all. That's just an agreed upon subjectivity that is subject to change. But also that, what if everyone in the society agrees that doing heroin is, righteous, and that's your portal to happiness? Is that going to become either subjectively or objectively like what yields happiness? And then later on, if a new stigma is formed, what do we think about the old stigma? Do we admit that was not objective, or what do we say about it? I think you run into a couple problems.
Yeah, probably. So let's get a couple more comments and we'll move on to that next Bitcoin.
You can have an idea of happiness without objective standards, and you can base it off of a feeling just because you can ask a person if they're happy or not. And so you might need some kind of objective standards to have a bunch of people decide whether one person is happy or not. But it would still make sense if you could just have people say that they're happy or they're not happy, and we wouldn't need objective standards to do that.
Okay. Luke?
Yeah, and I think what I mean by objective standards, which I think is different than what Nate might mean, but I think Isaac pointed to what I mean by objective standards, which is like an objective fact about our psychology, that whether we are aware of it or not, that we are pursuing something, that we do have second-order desires. So when we want to go running every day of the week, but in the morning we wake up and we don't want to get out of bed, we think that we one way to be happy is to stay in bed because that's pleasurable, and yes, you are happy, but you would be even happier if you got up and ran that lap. And that's what I mean by objective standards is like an objective fact about our subjectivity or about our psychology that we do want, that is a true thing that we want. And I think, and I know Laura disagrees, and probably a lot of people disagree, so I'm probably wrong about it, but I think Aristotle means that as well. I think when he's trying to find out what we're all aiming at, he's looking at what people are aiming at first. He's not suggesting what they're aiming at. He's saying, what is everyone going for? And if two people are going for two different things, then he generalizes it. He keeps making it vaguer and vaguer until he incorporates everything. So it's not like he's trying to push something on everyone. He's trying to back up until he incorporates everyone. And he says, well, that's the highest good. That's what we really want. And maybe someone says, well, that's not what I really want. But then we can argue with them and say, like, well, think about it. Do you want to get up out of bed? I think you really do want this. I think this is what you want. I think Aristotle's making that claim that we are pursuing these things. We objectively want them. That there is like this self, this inner being that we might lie to ourselves or cheat ourselves or not know about ourselves, but it does exist.
All right, I think we should move on to the last question then.
I think it's part of it.
All right, go ahead.
I was going to say about the dictionary definition point, I think that the dictionary, objective definition, because, definitions can be seen as like an objective truth, I guess. It's referring to an objective state that someone could feel based on different subjective circumstances. So I think if you ask someone if they're happy, you're asking if they feel a certain specific way that humans have the capability of feeling, but that can be brought about by many different circumstances, where subjective standards come in.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Like, if you were to define happiness as just like an endorphin rush and stuff, there's like serial killers get endorphin rushes by like killing their victims. So it's like a really like you can't. It's hard to like put a label on that. Or just, like,
Well, I think that's pleasure, not happiness. I think happiness is something that has to do with the totality of a life.
Mhm.
Pleasure is something that has to do with the feeling of happiness in a short period of time. And I think when
what if someone
we're talking
dedicates
about the
their-
analysis of the totality of a life.
What if someone
Pretty
like
much.
dedicates their life to pleasure then? Wouldn't that-
Well, maybe they would qualify for, they lived that whole life successfully being pleasurable.
Mhm.
Maybe they would qualify for having the term happiness ascribed to them for the totality of their life. Maybe.
Okay.
But if you were happy or pleasurable for 10 years and you had 80 years of suffering,
Yeah.
I don't know if you would qualify as having a happy life.
Okay. So let's move on to the third point. I think it says having or hiring. What?
Did you actually answer the second point, or just argue the first question?
We are running out of time to answer the second point, so. Having others.
Two and three depend on one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine. Having others. Listen, it's like 5:17. Having other things to do. Having other things. Do these standards plausibly include cultivating intellectual and character values? And
It's among.
what?
First
Among.
among.
I can't read it from here. Thanks. Among other things, you guys see it. And then, do they include civic engagement, involvement in the lives of others? Okay. What's up? Oh, sorry.
No. I think we don't know if actually know.
Oh, it's no to the answer to the
Yes.
question. I thought I got your name wrong.
I think, like, first of all, Crowd himself says that we have no way of actually knowing these standards. And I guess Aristotle would like to say they include these, but I don't think we have any way of necessarily knowing them. We have no reason for picking them. I personally think a particularly good standard would be, to have the most pleasure in everyone's lives for the most amount of time, and so these don't really seem to have any basis as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, does this go back to that whole like how we can't ascribe happiness to like a single trait or single like action or something? That's what I got from reading it, but I might just be reading it wrong. I'm trying to like clarify the question because I didn't understand it.
I think you mean one or any of these things,
Okay.
just in general. It doesn't have to be just one.
Okay. So.
See, I think if there are objective standards, which I'm not convinced there are yet, but if there were, I think these would be necessary parts of it. Because if it were there, you'd have to be cultivated and intellectual to figure it out. maybe not the character values, but maybe is the kinds of traits that Aristotle brings up. Not all of them, obviously.